The Colorado Territory stretched endlessly before Thomas Hartwell's weathered cabin, a sea of golden grass interrupted only by the distant purple shadows of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. He sat on his porch in the pre-dawn darkness, coffee growing cold in his tin cup, watching the horizon for signs of trouble that never seemed to come anymore. The war had been over for 3 years, but Thomas still woke each morning with the expectation of enemy riders cresting the hill, still felt phantom pain where his left arm should have been. The sleeve of his flannel shirt hung empty, pinned neatly at the shoulder, a Confederate sharpshooter's gift from Gettysburg that had cost him more than flesh and bone. It had cost him Sarah, who couldn't bear to look at the man who returned in place of the whole one she'd married. It had cost him his father's ranch in Kansas, sold to pay debts accumulated during his long recovery. Most of all, it had cost him a belief that God had any particular plan for Thomas Hartwell beyond survival. His cattle lowed softly in the distance. 43 had of stubborn longhorns that represented everything he owned in the world. The territorial government had granted him this homestead in recognition of his service, though Thomas suspected it was more about placing a reliable gun, even a one-armed one, on the troubled border between white settlement and Ute territory. The arrangement suited him fine. Solitude had become his closest companion, silence his most trusted advisor. The eastern sky began to lighten, painting the grass tipped silver with dew. Thomas rose slowly, his joints protesting the mountain cold that seemed to settle deeper into his bones each year. At 32, he felt decades older, aged by experiences that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with the weight of memories he couldn't put down. The morning routine called, cattle to check, fences to mend, the endless small tasks that kept a man's hands busy and his mind from wandering down paths that led nowhere good. He was reaching for his hat when the sound cut through the morning stillness like a blade through silk. A woman's voice, crying out in pain or fear. He couldn't tell which, but the sound carried desperation that made his chest tighten with recognition. Thomas had heard that particular note of human anguish before, in field hospitals where boys died calling for their mothers, in burning towns where families huddled in root cellars praying for deliverance that might never come. Without conscious thought, he was moving toward the sound, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle that wasn't there before remembering he'd left it inside. But the voice came again, weaker now, and Thomas realized it was coming from the direction of Willow Creek, where the water ran shallow over smooth stones and cottonwoods provided the only real shade for miles around. Thomas found her half submerged in the creek, the water around her stained pink with blood that caught the early morning light like scattered garnets. She was young, perhaps 20, with the high cheekbones and bronze skin that marked her as Ute, though her clothing suggested she'd been among white settlers recently. A calico dress, torn and muddy, clung to her slight frame, and her long black hair fanned out in the water like dark silk. The wound was in her side, just below the ribs, and it was deep enough to be serious but not immediately fatal if treated properly. Thomas had seen enough battlefield injuries to know the difference. What concerned him more was the exhaustion in her face, the way her eyes fluttered closed as if she were fighting to stay conscious. She'd been traveling for hours, maybe days, pushing herself far past the point where most people would have collapsed. "Miss," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened slowly, focusing on his face with difficulty. When she saw him clearly, a white man with battle scars and an empty sleeve, fear flickered across her features. But she was too weak to run, and perhaps too smart to try. Instead, she said something in Ute that he didn't understand, then switched to heavily accented English. "Please," she whispered, "they will come for me. You must not let them find me here." Thomas felt the familiar weight of decision settling on his shoulders, the kind of choice that would echo through every day that followed. He could leave her here, ride into town for the territorial marshal, let the proper authorities handle whatever trouble she brought to his doorstep. It would be the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that wouldn't complicate his carefully constructed solitude. But looking down at her face, seeing the trust and desperation warring in her dark eyes, Thomas realized that some choices weren't really choices at all. They were tests of what remained of a man's soul after everything else had been stripped away. He'd failed enough of those tests for one lifetime. "What's your name?" he asked, kneeling beside the creek. "Aiyana," she said, the word soft as breath. It means eternal blossom. A bitter smile crossed her lips. Though I feel more like autumn leaf now. Thomas carefully lifted her from the water, surprised by how light she was, how fragile she felt in his single arm. The missing limb made everything more difficult, but he'd learned to compensate, to find balance where none should exist. "I'm Thomas Hartwell," he said, "and whatever brought you here, Miss Aiyana, it can wait until we get that wound tended." She looked up at him as he carried her toward his cabin, her eyes searching his face for something he couldn't name. "You are soldier," she said, not quite a question. "Was," Thomas replied, "long time ago." "Soldiers bring death," she whispered. "But sometimes they bring salvation, too." As Thomas pushed through the cabin door with his burden, he wondered which one he would prove to be for this wounded stranger who'd stumbled into his solitary world like a message written in blood and desperation. Thomas's cabin reflected the practical simplicity of a man who'd learned to need very little. A single room with rough-hewn log walls, a stone fireplace, a table and 2 chairs that had come to place, and a bed that served mainly as storage since Thomas preferred to sleep on the floor with his back against the wall. Old habits from the war that comfort couldn't break. The only decoration was a faded daguerreotype of his parents on the mantelpiece, their stern faces looking down with what he imagined was disappointment at what their son had become. He laid Aiyana on the bed as gently as he could, then set about gathering supplies to tend her wound. His medical knowledge was crude but functional, learned in field hospitals where speed mattered more than technique, and survival was often a matter of luck as much as skill. Clean cloth for bandages, whiskey for disinfectant, needle and thread for stitching. The essentials of frontier medicine. "This will hurt," he warned, showing her the bottle of whiskey. Aiyana nodded, her jaw set with a kind of determination that suggested pain was an old acquaintance. "I have known worse," she said simply. As Thomas cleaned the wound, she told of her story in fragments, pausing when the pain became too intense to speak. She was the daughter of a Ute chief who tried to maintain peace with the white settlers moving into the valley. But peace was a fragile thing, easily shattered by greed and misunderstanding. A group of prospectors had found gold in a stream that ran through sacred Ute hunting grounds, and they demanded the right to mine there despite treaty obligations. "My father said no," Aiyana explained, wincing as Thomas began to stitch the wound. "The mountain spirits live in that place. To dig gold would be like digging graves in your church." But the prospectors hadn't cared about spirits or treaties. They brought guns and territorial officials with papers that somehow made the sacred land legally theirs. When the Ute refused to move, shots were fired. Aiyana's father had fallen in the first volley, along with her brother and 2 cousins. She'd escaped in the chaos, carrying her father's dying words. "Find a white man who helps those with nowhere else to go." "He meant you?" Thomas asked, tying off the last stitch. "I think so," Aiyana said, though uncertainty colored her voice. "My father spoke of soldier who saved you children from bad men last winter. Soldier with 1 arm who asked nothing in return." Thomas remembered that night. A group of drifters had been harassing a Ute family camped near the territorial road, and he'd intervened more from instinct than any particular sense of justice. He'd forgotten about it until now. But apparently the story had traveled through the Ute community, growing into something larger than the simple act it had been. "Miss Aiyana," Thomas said carefully, "I'm honored by your father's trust, but I'm not sure what I can do for you. The territorial marshal will have to be informed about what happened to your people. There'll be an investigation, maybe a trial." "No," she said, struggling to sit up despite her wound. "You do not understand. The men who killed my family, they wear badges now. The territorial officials, they signed papers first, then sent guns after. There will be no trial because there was no crime in their eyes." The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. If Aiyana was right, then the massacre hadn't been the result of a dispute gone wrong. It had been a planned execution disguised as law enforcement. And if the territorial government was involved, then going through official channels would be like leading a lamb to slaughter. Outside, the morning sun was climbing higher, and Thomas could hear his cattle moving restlessly in their pasture. Soon, he would need to make decisions that would affect not just this wounded woman, but his own carefully constructed isolation. The war had taught him that neutrality was often impossible, that sometimes a man had to choose sides whether he wanted to or not. Marshal Wade Brennan arrived at Thomas's cabin 2 days later, his badge catching the afternoon sun like a challenge. He was a large man with the kind of confidence that came from wearing authority like armor, and his pale eyes held the calculating coldness of someone who'd learned to measure everything in terms of profit and loss. Behind him rode 2 deputies, men whose faces suggested they were more comfortable with violence than law. "Thomas," Brennan said, dismounting with the casual authority of someone who expected to be welcomed everywhere. "Heard you might have found something that belongs to the territory." Thomas stepped out of his cabin, positioning himself between the marshal and the door where Aiyana rested inside. She'd been recovering steadily, but she was still weak and in no condition to run if trouble started. "Depends on what you're looking for, Wade." "Ute girl, about 20, wounded in a skirmish up north." Brennan's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "There's been some unpleasantness with the tribe, and she's wanted for questioning about an attack on some prospectors." The lie came so smoothly that Thomas might have believed it if he hadn't heard Aiyana's version first. "Haven't seen any Ute girls," he said. "But then, I don't see much of anybody out here." Brennan studied Thomas's face with the attention of someone who'd made a career of spotting deception. "That's funny, because Jake Morrison swears he saw you carrying someone toward your cabin day before yesterday. Jake's got good eyes, and he's not much given to flights of fancy." Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest that came before violence, the same feeling he'd had before every battle in the war. But this time was different. This time he wasn't fighting for some abstract cause or political principle. He was standing between an innocent woman and the men who'd already murdered her family. "Jake sees a lot of things when he's been drinking," Thomas said evenly. "Most of them aren't there." One of the deputies, a thin man with nervous hands, shifted in his saddle. "Marshal, maybe we should just search the place. Be quicker than all this talking." Brennan held up a hand, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. "Now, boys, Thomas here is a war hero. Congressional Medal of Honor. If I recall correctly, we don't want to be disrespectful to a man who served his country." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. "Course, that was the Union Army, wasn't it, Thomas? Some folks around here still have strong feelings about that particular conflict. The threat was clear enough. In this part of Colorado territory, where Confederate sympathizers had fled after the war, Thomas's Union service could easily be painted as a liability rather than an honor. And Marshal Brennan was the kind of man who would use any weapon available to get what he wanted. "What exactly are you proposing, Wade?" Thomas asked. Brennan's smile widened. "Simple business arrangement. You help us find this Ute girl, and we make sure your past service is remembered in the right light. Might even be able to arrange some territorial contracts for your cattle. Good money in feeding the mining camps." The offer was tempting in its straightforward corruption. Thomas's ranch was barely profitable, and military pension only went so far in a territory where everything had to be shipped in at great expense. But looking at Brennan's face, he could see Aiyana's father and brother lying dead in some nameless gulch, their blood the price of gold that would never benefit anyone but distant investors. "Appreciate the offer," Thomas said. "But I told you, haven't seen any Ute girls." Brennan's expression hardened. "That's unfortunate, Thomas. Real unfortunate." He remounted his horse with deliberate slowness. "We'll be keeping an eye on things around here. Territory's got a responsibility to protect its citizens from hostile Indians, you understand." As the 3 men rode away, Thomas knew he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. By refusing Brennan's offer, he'd made himself an enemy of men who had the law on their side and no scruples about how they used it. That evening, as purple shadows crept across the valley like fingers of approaching night, Aiyana sat by Thomas's fireplace wrapped in one of his old army blankets. Her wound was healing well, but her eyes held the haunted look of someone who'd seen too much of the world's cruelty in too short a time. The firelight played across her face, highlighting the delicate bone structure that spoke of generations of people who'd live in harmony with this harsh land. "They will return," she said quietly, "and next time they will not ask permission to search." Thomas nodded, poking at the fire with an iron rod. "Likely so. Question is, what do we do about it? Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if they held answers to questions she was afraid to ask. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of desperate calculation. There's a way, but it would require sacrifice from both of us. What kind of sacrifice? She looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Marriage. If I am your wife, then I am no longer just a Ute refugee. I become a territorial citizen with rights under white man's law. They cannot simply take me without due process. The suggestion hit Thomas like a physical blow. Marriage had been something he'd shared with Sarah, something that belonged to the man he'd been before the war changed everything. The idea of entering into such a sacred bond as a mere legal strategy felt like desecration of something he thought lost forever. But looking at Aiyana's face, seeing the desperate hope warring with pride in her expression, Thomas realized she was offering more than just a practical solution. She was offering trust of the deepest kind, placing her fate entirely in the hands of a white stranger because she had nowhere else to turn. That's assuming Marshal Brennan would respect the law. Thomas said carefully, men like that have ways of getting around inconvenient legal protections. Perhaps, Aiyana agreed, but it would make things more difficult for them. And it would give us time to find another solution. Thomas stood and walked to the single window, looking out at the star-filled Colorado sky. In the distance, he could see the lights of the territorial settlement where Brennan held court, dispensing his particular brand of justice to anyone who couldn't afford to buy their way out of trouble. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was considering marriage to protect a woman from the very government he'd bled to preserve. There's something you should know, he said without turning around. I'm not the man I was before the war. The things I've seen, the things I've done, they change me in ways that can't be undone. I'm not sure I'm capable of being a proper husband to anyone. Aiyana's voice was soft but firm when she replied. And I am not the woman I was before my family was murdered. We are both broken, Thomas Hartwell. But perhaps broken pieces can still fit together if placed carefully. He turned to face her, seeing in her expression the same mixture of courage and fear he'd felt before every major battle of his military career. If we do this, he said, it has to be real, not just in the eyes of the law, but in truth. I won't dishonor the institution of marriage by treating it as mere convenience. Aiyana stood slowly, favoring her wounded side, and walked to where he stood by the window. In the starlight, she looked ethereal, like a spirit of the mountains given human form. My people believe that marriage is not just the joining of two people, but the joining of two destinies. Perhaps the spirits brought us together for reasons we do not yet understand. She extended her hand to him, palm up, and after a moment's hesitation, Thomas placed a single hand in hers. Her skin was warm and callous from work, real and solid in a way that grounded him to the present moment. Tomorrow, he said, we'll ride to the territorial office and find a magistrate. But tonight, we should pray that we're not making a mistake that will destroy us both. The territorial magistrate was a thin, nervous man named Josiah Crane who operated out of a cramped office above the general store in Rimrock Settlement. His hand shook slightly as he examined the documents Thomas had prepared, a marriage license application that reduced the complexity of two lives to a few lines of bureaucratic prose. The morning sun slanted through dusty windows, casting everything in shades of gold and amber that made the simple ceremony feel more significant than either Thomas or Aiyana had intended. This is irregular, Crane said, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. An Indian woman marrying a homesteader. Not that it's illegal, you understand, but it's bound to cause talk. We're not particularly concerned with talk, Thomas replied, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone who'd given orders in desperate circumstances. We just need the marriage legally recognized. Aiyana stood beside him in a simple blue dress they'd purchased from the general store that morning, her long black hair braided with small white flowers she'd picked along the trail. She'd insisted on the flowers, saying that even a marriage of necessity deserved some acknowledgement of beauty. Her wounded side was carefully concealed beneath the dress, and to any casual observer, she might have been just another frontier bride, nervous but hopeful about her future. Crane cleared his throat and opened a well-worn Bible, the leather binding cracked from years of frontier use. Do you, Thomas James Hartwell, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and hold in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part? Thomas looked down at Aiyana, seeing in her dark eyes a reflection of his own uncertainty and determination. I do, he said. The words carried more weight than he'd expected. And do you? Crane paused, consulting his notes. Aiyana, I'm sorry, miss, what's your family name? Clearwater. Aiyana said quietly. My father was chief of the Clearwater Band. Do you, Aiyana Clearwater, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and hold, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part? Aiyana's answer came without hesitation. I do. Crane pronounced them husband and wife with a relieved air of someone completing an unpleasant but necessary task. There was no ring. Thomas had lost his wedding ring from his first marriage somewhere in the mud of Virginia, and they'd had no time to arrange for another. Instead, Aiyana took a small braided cord from her hair and tied it around Thomas's wrist, murmuring something in Ute that he didn't understand but that felt like a blessing. They were walking back to their horses when Marshal Brennan appeared. Seemingly from nowhere, his badge catching the morning light, like a predator's eye. Well, well, he said, his voice carrying false joviality. Congratulations are in order, I see. Thomas Hartwell, married man, and to such a lovely bride. Thomas felt Aiyana tense beside him, her hand moving instinctively toward the knife at her belt, but her voice was steady when she spoke. Thank you, Marshal. Thomas and I are very happy. Brennan's smile was all teeth and no warmth. I'm sure you are. It's always heartwarming to see folks finding each other in these harsh times. He paused, his pale eyes moving between them like a snake tasting the air. Of course, marriage brings responsibilities, legal obligations. A man's got to protect his wife from all sorts of dangers, hostile Indians, fugitives from justice, folks who might not have her best interests at heart. The threat was clear enough, but Thomas had expected it. I'm sure my wife and I can handle any dangers that come our way, he said evenly. We're both pretty experienced with hardship. I'm sure you are, Brennan agreed. But the territory's got resources that private citizens don't. Protection, legal assistance, even financial opportunities for folks who know how to cooperate with proper authority. Aiyana stepped forward, her chin raised with the pride of generations of chief daughters. We appreciate the territory's concern, Marshal Brennan, but my husband and I prefer to make our own way. Brennan's expression darkened. That's your choice, Mrs. Hartwell. But choices have consequences. You do well to remember that. As the marshal walked away, Thomas realized that their marriage had bought them time, but it hadn't solved their fundamental problem. Brennan and his allies still wanted Aiyana dead or disappeared, and a piece of paper. Even a legal marriage certificate wouldn't protect her if they decided to act outside the law. The attack came on a moonless night 2 weeks after the wedding, when shadows moved like living things across the high desert, and every sound carried the potential of violence. Thomas woke to the soft whinny of horses moving where no horses should be, the kind of noise that spoke to instincts honed by years of sleeping in hostile territory. Beside him, Aiyana stirred, her hand immediately finding the knife she kept beneath her pillow. How many? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Thomas listened carefully, sorting through the night sounds with the attention of someone who'd learned that survival often depended on details others missed. 4, maybe 5, moving careful like, trying not to wake us. They dressed quickly and silently, Thomas strapping on his gun belt, while Aiyana gathered a small pack she kept ready since their wedding day. They'd planned for this moment, discussed what they'd do if Brennan decided that legal niceties were less important than permanent solutions to inconvenient problems. The root cellar, Thomas said. You can get to the horses from there without being seen. Aiyana shook her head. I will not leave you to face them alone. This isn't about heroics, Thomas replied, checking his revolver. It's about keeping you alive long enough to get word to the territorial capital about what's happening here. If we both die tonight, Brennan wins completely. Through the cabin's single window, they could see dark shapes moving among the outbuildings, searching for the best approach to the house. The men moved with the confidence of those who'd done this kind of work before, and Thomas realized that Brennan hadn't sent amateur thugs. These were professionals, the kind of men who made problems disappear without leaving evidence behind. A voice called out from the darkness, rough and carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Thomas Hartwell, we know you're in there. Come out with the Indian, and nobody has to get hurt." Thomas recognized the voice. Jake Morrison, the drunk who'd supposedly seen him carrying Aiyana to his cabin. Apparently, Brennan had decided to give Jake a chance to prove his loyalty through violence. "My wife is a territorial citizen," Thomas called back. "You've got no legal authority here." Morrison's laughter was harsh and without humor. "Legal authority? Mister, we're the only authority that matters out here. Now stop wasting time and send out the squaw." Aiyana's eyes flashed with anger at the slur, but she kept her voice controlled. "They mean to kill us both," she said quietly. "Legal marriage or no, dead people cannot testify." Thomas nodded, his mind racing through possibilities. The cabin was defensible, but only against a frontal assault. If Morrison's men were smart enough to set fire to the building, they'd be forced out into the open where superior numbers would tell. And Thomas's missing arm made him less effective in a sustained gunfight than he'd been during the war. "There's another way," Aiyana said, reading his thoughts. "My people know paths through these mountains that white men have never seen. If we can reach the high country, we can disappear until help arrives." "And if help doesn't arrive?" Aiyana smiled, and for a moment Thomas saw not the wounded refugee he'd found by the creek, but the daughter of chiefs who'd survived in this harsh land for countless generations. "Then we live free in the mountains, and our children learn the old ways." The casual mention of children hit Thomas like a physical blow. In the weeks since their marriage, he'd tried not to think about the future beyond simple survival. But looking at Aiyana's face in the dim light, he realized that somewhere along the way, their marriage of convenience had begun to transform into something deeper and more complex. Outside, the voices were growing more impatient, and Thomas could smell smoke on the wind. Morrison's men were preparing to burn them out. "The root cellar it is," he said. "But we go together or not at all." Aiyana nodded, her hand finding his with the sure touch of someone who'd learned to trust completely. "Together, then, whatever comes." 6 months later, Thomas stood on the porch of their rebuilt cabin, watching Aiyana tend to a small garden where corn and squash grew in the traditional Three Sisters pattern her grandmother had taught her. The federal investigators had finally arrived from Denver, drawn by reports of corruption and murder that could no longer be ignored. Marshall Brennan was in territorial prison awaiting trial, and Jake Morrison had disappeared entirely, probably fled to California, where no one would ask inconvenient questions about his past. The valley had found a tentative peace, but Thomas knew that the deeper changes lay not in the external world, but in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the way Aiyana's presence had slowly filled the empty corners of his cabin and his life. She moved with unconscious grace among the growing plants. Her wounded side healed now, but for a thin white scar that caught the morning light like silver thread. "The corn will be ready soon," she said, straightening and brushing dirt from her hands. "And Mrs. Chun says the territorial government might approve funding for a proper school here. For all the children, white Mexican, and you together." Thomas nodded, still amazed by how naturally Aiyana spoke of the future, as if hope were something that could be cultivated like any other crop. The war had taught him to live from day to day, never planning beyond the next battle or the next meal. But marriage, real marriage, not the legal arrangement they'd begun with, had slowly taught him to think in seasons and years again. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, joining her among the corn stalks. "About why I really came out here, why I chose solitude over trying to rebuild what I'd lost." Aiyana looked up at him with the patient attention she gave to everything, her dark eyes holding no judgment, only acceptance of whatever truth he was ready to share. "I did things in the war," Thomas continued, his voice rough with the effort of speaking words he'd kept buried for years. "Necessary things, maybe, but not clean things. Not the kind of things a man can easily live with afterward." He paused, looking out at the mountains where eagles rode the thermals with effortless grace. "I thought if I stayed alone, kept apart from folks, maybe the damage would stay contained. wouldn't spread to anyone else. Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, her fingers gentle on a corn silk that caught the breeze like spun gold. When she spoke, her words carried the wisdom of someone who'd learned to find meaning in suffering. My people believe that some wounds can only heal when they're shared, that carrying pain alone makes it grow larger, like shadows in firelight. She took his hand, the one hand that remained to him, and placed it against her cheek where the morning sun had warmed her skin. You saved my life by the creek, Thomas Hartwell, but perhaps I saved yours too, in ways neither of us understood at the time. Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, a lightning he thought lost forever in the smoke and blood of battlefields. The war had taken his arm, his first marriage, his faith in the goodness of the world. But this woman, this brave, wise, impossibly strong woman, had given him something he'd never expected to find again. The belief that broken things could still be useful, that love could grow in the most unlikely soil. I love you, he said, the words surprising him with their simplicity and truth. Not because I married you, not because I was trying to save you, because you healed parts of me I thought were dead forever. Aiyana smiled, and the expression transformed her face from merely beautiful to radiant. And I love you, my wounded warrior, because you showed me that sometimes the gentlest souls are found in the most battle-scarred bodies. As they stood together among the growing corn, Thomas realized that healing wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending that wounds had never existed. It was about learning to carry scars with grace, about finding in shared struggle the foundation for something stronger than either person could build alone. The war had taught him about death and destruction, but marriage to Aiyana was teaching him about resurrection. Not the kind promised in distant heavens, but the kind that happened every morning, when two people chose to face another day together, creating from their combined brokenness something whole and beautiful and entirely new. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains with ferocity that caught even the old-timers by surprise. Snow fell in thick curtains that transformed the familiar landscape into something ethereal and strange, muffling all sound except the whisper wind through bare cottonwood branches. Thomas stood at their cabin window, watching Aiyana move gracefully through the drifts toward the barn where their cattle huddled together for warmth. She was 7 months pregnant now, her condition evident in the careful way she balanced herself against the wind, one hand instinctively protecting the life growing within her. The child had been conceived in love rather than duty, a tangible symbol of how their marriage had evolved from desperate necessity into something neither had dared hope for when they first spoke vows in that cramped territorial office. The storm will pass by morning, Aiyana said, stamping snow from her boots as she returned to the cabin's warmth. But we should prepare for more. The eagles have been flying low, and my grandmother always said that meant the mountain spirits were gathering their strength for a long winter. Thomas helped her out of her heavy coat, marveling as always at how naturally she moved between two worlds, the practical knowledge of frontier life and the deeper wisdom of her people's connection to the land. In the months since their marriage had become real rather than merely legal, he'd learned to trust her instincts about weather and seasons, finding in her traditional knowledge a complement to his own hard-won understanding of survival. Mrs. Chin stopped by this morning while you were checking the cattle, Thomas said, stirring the stew that had been simmering over their fire. The territorial governor finally approved funding for the school. They'll start construction come spring. Aiyana's face lit up with genuine pleasure. The school had been her dream from almost the moment they'd settled into married life, a place where children of all backgrounds could learn together, where the artificial divisions that had caused so much bloodshed might begin to heal through education rather than violence. She'd already begun teaching some of the local children to read, using a mixture of English primers and traditional youth stories that connected ancient wisdom to modern needs. And the teacher? She asked, settling into the chair Thomas had built specially for her changing shape. That would be you, if you're willing, Thomas replied with a smile. Seems the Territorial Education Board was impressed by your letters about integrated curriculum and cultural understanding. They've offered you the position formally. Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, her hands resting on her rounded belly where her child moved restlessly, as if sensing its mother's excitement. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. My father always said that education was the bridge between worlds. That knowledge shared freely could accomplish what treaties and laws could not. Thomas knelt beside her chair, his single hand covering both of hers. "He will be proud of you," he said quietly, "proud of what you've built from the ashes of what was lost." Through the window, they could see lights beginning to appear in the scattered homesteads that dotted the valley, families gathering around their own fires, sharing their own stories, creating the small domestic rituals that bound communities together. The population had grown steadily since Brennan's removal from power, drawn by reports of fair treatment and profitable farming in a territory where cooperation had replaced exploitation. "Thomas," Aiyana said, her voice carrying a note of wonder, "do you ever think about how different our lives would have been if I hadn't stumbled into your creek that morning?" Thomas considered the question seriously, imagining a dozen different paths their lives might have taken. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "But I've come to believe that some meetings are meant to happen, regardless of the circumstances that bring them about. Maybe you would have found your way to me eventually, or I to you. Maybe the spirits or God, or whatever force guides such things, had plans that neither of us could see at the time." Aiyana smiled, leaning into his touch with the unconscious trust that had become second nature between them. "My grandmother used to say that love was like a river. It would always find its way to the sea, no matter how many rocks try to block its path." Outside, the wind howled through the mountains with ancient voice, carrying stories of all the lives that had been lived and lost in this harsh, beautiful land. But inside their cabin, warmed by fire and love and the promise of new life growing between them, Thomas and Aiyana had found something that neither war nor prejudice nor the casual cruelty of desperate men could destroy. A place where two wounded souls had learned to heal each other, creating from their shared brokenness a foundation strong enough to support not just their own happiness, but the dreams of generations yet to come.